Thank you so much to Open Athens for the invitation to give this keynote. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to present some of our work in 30 minutes, what might be a bit of a worldwide tour, touching, I think, on a lot of the themes that Heidi and John, you spoke about community, about trust, and about moving forward together, research integrity, another main thread, of course. So my name is Hylke Koers. I'm the Chief Information Officer for STM Solutions. And STM Solutions is the operational arm of the STM Association. STM is the international trade body for scholarly academic publishers. We have close to 150 members across the globe. And the work that we do is really organized around 4 key strategic areas: research integrity, social responsibility, open research, and standards and technology. So my talk today is called The Future of Trust, Access, and Identity in Scholarly Communications. This page is not intentionally left blank, but I do want to say before I dive in that this is a tall order. It's entirely self-inflicted that this is a tall order. But I think it's a tall order for 2 reasons. One, because like John already mentioned in his presentation, things change and things perpetually change, but it feels like we're going through a phase of maybe accelerating change and really potential change for very fundamental things, very fundamental qualities and values. And 2, of course, there are many aspects, many different directions that we could take a conversation about trust, access, and identity. So whenever I find myself in a situation where there is a lot of ground to cover and a lot of different directions you could take, I find myself looking for a structure, some kind of an organizational principle. And quoting my colleague Richard Northover, who likes to say that everything in life is either a flowchart or a Venn diagram. In this case, I thought there was a really good Venn diagram to organize the presentation. So here you have it. This is a diagram that I'll use as a guide, a navigational guide throughout this presentation. And let me briefly take you through to also give a little bit of an agenda of the keynote today. First, though, a good occasion to call out one reason why identity is so important in scholarly publishing: attribution, a hallmark of scholarly publishing to indicate provenance and also to give credit where credit is due. So see the attribution line at the bottom right. So let me guide you through this diagram, and I'll start at the bottom left, which is around resource access. I would argue that this is a fairly well established aspect of identity in scholarly communication. To be precise, we're talking about the organizational identity, the connection between an individual and the organization that they are affiliated with. It's needed to manage access to journals or other resources that have some form of a subscription model or other access requirements. And the user affiliation there is typically needed for access management, as well as looking into usage patterns and being able to aggregate usage of individuals to an institution or another organization. Moving to the top of the Venn diagram, personalization. I think it's fair to say that this became a topic of interest in scholarly communications about 10 years ago, I would think, where we saw that publishers and service providers realized how they could improve their offerings by using information that is specific about the user, not only their affiliation, but things like publication history, reading history. Some examples of this would be recommenders, recommendation engines, personalized alerts. I won't go into this topic in any further detail. First of all, there is limited time, so I needed to make a selection, and also I don't consider myself a real expert on this element. So the third part of the Venn diagram is around editorial or research integrity, and I think this is an area where, at least to my mind, identity hasn't really played a very significant role so far, still in the context of scholarly communications. I also think that might be about to change, given some of the challenges that we're facing to protect research integrity, to protect authenticity and the integrity of the scholarly record. I'll speak about this in quite some detail in the second half of my presentation to you today. So first, let's take a look at resource access. as I mentioned, I think this is a fairly well-established application area of identity in scholarly communications. The user's affiliation is used to manage access to resources and also to be able to look at usage patterns that supersede the usage of an individual. Technically, despite some valid concerns with regard to security, reliability, user privacy, the majority of access, at least as I see it, the majority of access to scholarly articles is based on IP address, and this includes some higher level offerings, technologies like OpenURL or proxies, etc. A very good second, federated authentication. We saw a bit of a boost in the utilization of federated authentication at the start of the pandemic, when people used federated authentication to be able to access resources also working off campus. But still, today it is of much smaller size compared to IP authentication. So this has been around for quite some time. I'm sure this will not be a surprise to any of you in the audience. But of course, like John says, the world keeps changing. And some recent developments are introducing some additional complexity that I think are worth calling out in this context. The first source of complexity is what we call read and publish deals or transformational agreements, where there is an agreement between an institute who negotiates a deal with the publisher that covers both the reading as well as publishing, so the authoring side and the reading side of scholarly communication. That means there is a need typically to monitor the utilization of budgets on both the authoring side as well as on the reader side, and connecting these two parts is typically not easy at all, because traditionally quite different mechanisms and quite different standards have been used to associate an individual with an institute on the authoring side as compared to the reading side. So being able to match that up is not a trivial problem at all. Another source of complexity here are the new modalities of content distribution. And I think in particular about content syndication on platforms like ResearchGate or ScienceDirect, where the same publication is available on several distinct resources on the scholarly web. These different platforms typically use different identifiers for organizations. There's ROR, Ringgold, Grid, and several others. And that also makes it quite a difficult task to be able to integrate access management and to be able to aggregate usage data across these different platforms. So I thought this could be a good moment to call out a challenge that we see emerging, or a challenge that I hear about quite regularly, which is the ability to integrate these different organizational identifiers with each other, or at least have some form of interoperability that enables crosswalks from, for example, SAML entity IDs to RORs or Ringgolds or grids, etc. There are several initiatives and services in this direction, so this is definitely a challenge that is being worked on, but I think it's fair to say that this has not been fully cracked just yet. So let me move on to a specific project, and we're still in the area of resource access, a specific project that I've been involved with for a couple of years now, Seamless Access. Seamless Access is a not-for-profit collaborative initiative that's run by NISO, Internet2, Giant, and STM, designed to foster a streamlined online access experience when using scholarly collaboration tools, information resources, and shared research infrastructure. Another way to sort of simplify that whole mouthful is it's a way to make federated access easier. And Seamless Access has three main components. The first is this standard button, a recognizable button that can be implemented across different websites and has a call to action that users will start to recognize and start to trust. The second main value element is the ability to pre-populate that button with the user's institute as often as possible, because that may be remembered from a previous access journey when the user made that selection. And this is important for two reasons. A, it saves the user time to not have to find and select the institute from what could be a really long list, but it also strengthens the recognizability and the trust in the access flow, making it sort of lowering the cognitive barrier to click on that access through button. The third main element of the Seamless Access offering, in case where the user does does need to look up their institute is an IDP discovery service. And we have and continue to do a lot of user research on this, continually trying to improve and make this as user-friendly as possible. So I wanted to say a few words about what you may have heard about as browser changes. In brief, browser engines have been on a journey to change some of the very fundamental parts of how they work. And this has been a multi-year journey. This is not at all a new development. And at least the driving force behind this is legislation that is pushing for more user privacy. And so browser engines are looking to reevaluate, potentially remove features that can be used to follow people on the web without their explicit consent. Prime suspect third-party cookies, and many of you will have heard about third-party cookies being retired, even though timelines and exactly what that means keeps shifting and being sort of hard to grasp at times. The reason, though, why this is relevant for seamless access is that these changes impact the ability to remember the user's choice of institute across different websites, which seamless access uses to pre-populate that button. So that is a pretty big deal. Like I said, this has been a multi-year journey. As far as I could trace back, the first webinar that at least I have been involved with that we did on this topic is almost 4 years old, which was not long after I joined STM Solutions. So where we are now, after much analysis, much exploration, much discussion, much deliberation, is that seamless access has made the choice to implement a new technology that is called Storage Access API that will allow seamless access to keep remembering the user's choice of institute across different websites, and also doing that in a privacy-preserving manner, which is very important to the values of seamless access. This Storage Access API was developed as part of Google's Privacy Sandbox initiative, but it is I don't want too much to address them either now or like to across. We are publishing platforms and service providers like Open Athens to really collectively manage this transition. If you are in the audience and you work with seamless access and this is new to you, then please, I would highly recommend to read up about this. We have several articles on our blog, several blog posts, and really engage with the topic, because depending on your specific integration form, you may also need to make some changes on your end. Let me move on, and we're still in the district, if you like, in the area of resource access. I also wanted to briefly touch upon another project that I'm closely involved with called GetFTR, short for Get Full Text Research. This is an industry collaboration that was set up to streamline access to scholarly content. And GetFTR does that in two ways. First of all, by signaling entitlements to researchers at the point of discovery, as you see in the screenshot. So already at the point of discovery, the user knows that they will have access to this particular PDF. And then it provides smart links to streamline the onward access journey. Ideally, that means one-click access to the PDF. I should explain or underline that the signaling is really based on the user's access rights or entitlement rights to the content, and that could be because the article is open access, but also for content that is published in subscription-based journals, where it depends on the user's affiliation. So that is again why identity is relevant for this particular functionality. And also remember when we spoke about these different organizational identifiers before, GetFTR supports a range of them to be able to show this indicator as often as possible, supporting IP authentication, SAML, Ringgold, Grid, and ROR. So GetFTR started about 5 years ago and now covers close to 70% of newly published articles. So I think it's fair to say that this has become a quite well-established element of the scholarly communications infrastructure. What is new and what I wanted to also highlight specifically in this presentation And also where we start to make the connection to the theme of research integrity is that GetFDR now can also be used to alert researchers when content has been retracted or where there has been an erratum. And what makes GetFDR quite uniquely placed to do this is that it can deliver this information at the point of discovery. So when the researcher, the end user, has a list of search results in an integrating, for example, a discovery service that integrates with GetFDR or using the GetFDR browser extension, already at the moment when you see a search result list, you are notified in case an article has been retracted or has an erratum, etc. And it's really important because it helps to avoid that researchers inadvertently, without realizing it, base their work on publications that have since then been invalidated. The screenshot that you see shows the GetFDR browser extension running on Google Scholar, but we also have some native integrations on several discovery services and publishing platforms, for example, on reference lists. So that takes us from the area of resource access at the bottom left of the Venn diagram to research integrity at the bottom right. And this is where I want to switch gears a bit and talk about research integrity and some of the challenges that we are facing in this regard. This slide is a bit of an anthology of headlines from last year. This is all from last year that call attention to the challenges that academic publishers and the research community at large are facing in the area of research integrity. Of course, most researchers are acting in good faith and do so within the established academic norms of their community. There, of course, always have been occurrences of fraud or misconduct with problems ranging from the massaging of data, as it is sometimes called, to p-hacking, to fabricating entire research papers. And this has been around, unfortunately, for quite some time. Researchers are only human as well at the end of the day, but on relatively small scales. The change that we have seen over the last couple of years is the emergence of what are called paper mills, which are organizations that really take this to a whole new level. They offer services where you can procure entirely fabricated articles for sale or broker authorship to papers that in reality you had nothing to do with. And this is happening at a scale that is quite concerning. And we see that reflected in a big rise, significant growth in the number of journal articles that are being retracted on a yearly basis. This is a graph from a paper that was published by Nature News last year. I think the article or the title is mentioned at the bottom if you want to read more about that. So retractions are an example, the prime example perhaps, of how publishers play a role in the corrective process that is so important in scholarly communication, the self-correcting process. And retractions have traditionally been an integral part of that process. But there's also, I think, a pretty broad understanding that given the scale and the size and the significance of this problem, prevention is better than remediation. And that in addition to the remediation approaches by retractions, which will continue to be needed, additional efforts, additional push is required to also look at preventive measures. I think it's fair to say that publishers do a lot on this in their own organizations, and also that the amount of effort and attention has really stepped up in the last couple of years. So a lot of happening in individual organizations, and in addition to that, it's also been very rewarding to see how many publishers are willing to collaborate in appropriate ways to really address this problem for the entire publishing scholarly communication community, really address that also in a way that really joining forces and working together. A prime example of this of such a form of collaboration is the STM Integrity Hub, which we run out of STM Solutions. And that's a large-scale infrastructure that enables publishers to check submitted manuscripts, so at the point of submission, for various research integrity concerns. It's currently being used by 35 publishers and over hundreds of journals.
Hi everyone. I can see that Hylke's having connectivity challenges.
By
So what
our
I'm
estimates,
feedback.
this helps publishers already now stop tens of paper mail submissions every day. And again, this will grow as we continue to roll this out more widely. So while that is important and also a service that we are actively continuing to run and invest in and roll out, we also realize that there is more that we should do, especially looking at the impact of generative AI, which will no doubt make it increasingly difficult to establish the veracity and the authenticity of submitted papers only on the basis of content. So we started to look for other strategies to supplement the STM Integrity Hub, and we call that beyond the manuscript. One example, and given the time that I have, I'll just really mention this very quickly, is a report by Moorbranch, which STM has sponsored, that really looks at new technologies to establish the authenticity and the integrity of images and research data at the point of capture. The second example, which brings it back to the main topic of my presentation today, is around researcher identity. And the work that we have done on researcher identity started in the summer of 2023, when we established a task and finish group to look at digital identity specifically in the context of research integrity. About a year after the tasks and finish group started, this resulted in a first report that is available online. And we are now in the last stretch of preparing a follow-up report that also has a couple of concrete recommendations for publishers, editorial systems, and other stakeholder groups. So in the remainder of my talk today, I'll give you a bit of a tour of the work that we have done in this task and finish group around trusted identity in academic publishing, and present two of the main recommendations coming out of that work. So starting with the problem articulation, or really understanding the challenge that we are facing. One of the first things that we did is to survey publishers to get a better understanding of how important researcher identity is in this context of research integrity. We received responses from 12 publishers, including some of the big publishing houses. And that really corroborated our hypothesis that identity manipulation indeed can and oftentimes does play a role in research integrity breaches. And you can think about things like claiming fake authorship, impersonating reviewers, or even impersonating guest editors. So let's look in a bit more detail at the publication process to understand this problem a little bit better. On the slide, you see a simplified version of the publishing process, and starting at the moment when an author submits a paper to a particular journal. Usually they need to create an account, so they sign in or they register, and then they can upload the manuscript. They usually add some metadata, title, co-authors, suggested reviewers often, and then hit submit to submit the paper for peer review. Part of the process is usually to include a list of co-authors, and also quite often the author may suggest peer reviewers to look at the work. And of course, these are suggestions. Only if the editor accepts those suggestions will these people indeed be invited to perform the peer review. These peer reviewers then also need to sign in or register in order to receive the manuscript and start doing the review. Later on, they submit the peer review report, and assuming that the author that is presented here, they receive raving peer reviews, the editor accepts the work, it would proceed to be published, and all is well. So far so good, right? The problem, however, is that most editorial systems have very few safeguards to really validate the identity of all the actors, of the author, the peer reviewer, as well as the editor. And that makes it possible, for example, to add fake co-authors or even impersonate someone to act as a peer reviewer for your paper. And if that editorial process is subverted, then of course it becomes quite clear and much easier how a fake paper with entirely fabricated research is able to sometimes pass through the quality checks, pass through peer review and get published, which then may require yet another retraction, potentially a couple of years down the line. So we see that identity manipulation is a known tactic that can help bad actors to subvert the editorial peer review process. We also see that it's relatively easy to do this and manipulate the system and really exploit the trust that has always existed between publishers and researchers. I think this really brings it back to that notion of trust that Heidi was also speaking about. We also see that many platforms today accept opaque email addresses without any other form of verification. So you might ask, why is that? And I think the reason is this is really hard to do well in a responsible manner. And the reason is because we should not accept as a community that any additional verification step would exclude legitimate scholars or make the process much more difficult than it needs to be for all of those bona fide researchers out there. So there was the challenge that we set out to address. And I should stress that we're not at all pretending to have fixed this. This is a big, thorny problem. But we are proposing a framework that we hope will be helpful to drive progress, to think about this challenge in structured manners. And also we offer a couple of concrete recommendations that should already offer valuable improvements over the current status quo. So at a high level, the framework that we put forward recognizes 5 steps. There's the assessment, where the journal or the publisher needs to make a deliberate decision about acceptable risk levels. And really going from a system that's historically, largely based on trust to completely closed-door, zero trust type of environment like you would have in financial services, that wouldn't be appropriate and that wouldn't work, we believe, in our sector. So some middle ground there. There's the verification, which is the step where the user provides evidence of their identity and their legitimacy, which is then evaluated by the system to measure if the level of trust that is provided by the user meets the required level that is needed to proceed. If that's the case, we move to the action phase where the thing happens if the required level of trust is met. That could be that the article is accepted for peer review or someone is accepted to be a reviewer or a guest editor. And finally, we believe it's important that there is an ongoing process of feedback to learn from experience and fine-tune the system. A couple of things that I wanted to pull out from this framework. All the details will be described in a forthcoming publication, but a couple of things to call out in the about 5 minutes that I have left. First is that we recommend a very deliberate assessment of risk level, as not all situations present the same risk. It really depends on the role of the individual and the action that they are about to take, but it could also depend on the specific situation of the journal, the subject area, on its readership. And it's always up to the individual journal or publisher to make that decision. Equally, not all verification methods can provide the same level of trust. We really have to go sort of back to first principles and ask ourselves the question, what constitutes trust? And in the framework that we are putting forward, we propose that there are 2 main dimensions. There's the evidence of identity. Is this the person who they claim to be? And there's the evidence of legitimacy. Do we know something about this person that makes us trust them? So we can plot that in a 2x2 matrix. And in the bottom left, we basically know nothing about the user. No proof of identity or their legitimacy as a scholar. In the top left, we know something about the user's identity, but we have no evidence of their academic credibility. In the bottom right, we have some indication of the academic legitimacy, for example, prior publications or funding grants or an association with an institute. But we can be sure that they are, or we're not 100% sure that they are associated with the right person. And we argue that this quadrant actually gives less trust than the top left, because establishing someone's identity provides a route to at least accountability. The best situation, of course, is in the top right, when we have evidence that the user is who they claim to be, and there is some evidence that they are indeed legitimate academics, legitimate scholars. We can now take a look at different verification methods that are used, and this is a list of what we believe are some of the most widely used ones to verify a user by editorial systems. It's not meant to be exhaustive, and in fact, I'd love to hear about other verification mechanisms that could be applicable in the context. We have federated identity from going from top to bottom, which I'm sure many of you in the audience will be familiar with, allowing the user to log in via their institute's credentials. And that establishes an association between the user and their institute. Same for institutional emails, similar to federated identity. It can be used to establish that link between the individual and their institute. ORCID, and I should expand on this a little bit, by default, ORCID records are populated with information by the user, so it is self-declared. So there may be things on someone's ORCID record that speak to their academic credibility, but the trustworthiness of that information is somewhat limited because people can make their own claims. That is really different with so-called ORCID trust markers, and that's a mechanism through which a verified ORCID member can add assertions about somebody, about an ORCID profile. That could be a publisher declaring that someone has published with them, an institute that someone works with them, or a funder that someone else has received a grant. And that makes a big difference because now the information comes from a trusted, authoritative source. So moving on, other mechanisms could be password verification services, like you see in several consumer platforms now. And we do think that as an option of a last resort, there should be some form of direct content to verify that someone is who they claim to be. This is clearly not a very scalable solution, but we do believe that such options will need to be offered to make sure that the process will not exclude any researchers with good intentions. We can do a bit of a coarse mapping of these verification methods on the trust diagram. And looking at the time, I'll skip over this and just summarize to say that you are able to look at existing verification methods and then put that on the diagram, which gives a bit of a guidance to publishers and editorial systems to see what would be the minimum set of verification mechanisms that could be acceptable. So on to our recommendations. We have some more, and more detailed recommendations will be in the report, but I want to highlight two. The first is that we recommend that manuscript submission peer review systems should stop trusting users on the basis of unverifiable email addresses like Gmail, Hotmail, etc. That's not to say they may not be used or that we would recommend that they should not be used. There are perfectly legitimate reasons for researchers to want to use a non-institutional email address. But in such cases, we recommend that they should be coupled with an additional step for identity verification. Our second recommendation is that publishers, funders, research institutes start to proactively populate ORCID with these verified attributes that they and other systems can trust. We believe that this has great potential to provide that backbone of authoritative information that will enable swift verification workflows. As I said before, we don't pretend that this solves the problem entirely. In fact, we are acutely aware of some of the challenges that need to be tackled as we develop this further. Just to name two, of course, not everyone has access to modern verification technology. And while we cannot accept that bona fide researchers wherever in the world are excluded from the process, verification may frustrate legitimate users. And I think that means that the onus is on us to come with recommendations that would make this as easy and simple as possible. But it does seem inevitable that it will introduce some friction. The analogy here is maybe compare it to a driver license. If you are a fantastic driver, getting that license may be just a burden for you. But at the end of the day, driver licenses do make the road a safer place. I'm mindful that I am a little bit over time. I wanted to end with just 3 predictions because I am speaking about the future of trust, access, and identity. So let me end my presentation with 3 predictions about the future, which we all know is always difficult to do. So don't hold me accountable. These are more predictions along the I bet you a good bottle of wine. First prediction is that over the next couple of years, we will see digital identity solutions, digital wallets perhaps, from consumer markets make their way into scholarly communication, starting slow, then scaling fast. My second prediction is that scholarly publishers will introduce, akin to financial services, sort of know your customer light programs. And then thirdly, which is going a level or 2 deeper, I would predict that trust hierarchies, as we know them from resource access, will also become indispensable in research integrity as well. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd love to address questions if we have time, but let me hand it back to John. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We've definitely got time. I think there's questions have come through. I'd love to have a conversation about the importance of federations themselves and that future of identity verification. I won't do that because I will go to the questions that we've had. I'll take them in order. There's sort of 4 questions. The first one is related to the impact of browser changes, and it's related to it talks about not using fixed IP systems, but I guess is that, but do you have a sort of a top level view of either how to address the differences between sort of IP recognition versus federated authentication, or where people go to find out more information?
In the context of what's happening with changes to these browser engines specifically,
yes.
John. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we know that the area where the browser engine vendors are actively making changes today is mostly third-party cookies or third-party access to information held by the browser, to generalize that a little bit, which has no or very limited impact to sort of the backbone of federated authentication, and that should all still work fine. But it does impact some of these higher level technologies like seamless access with the ability to remember the user's choice of institute across different websites. So that's prompted us to use that to put in place that other technology to still be able to do that. We know, and this is public information you can find on Google websites and blogs and developer resources, that people are also looking into IP authentication and whether that IP obfuscation should become more of a default. We have seen, of course, some browsers already make IP obfuscation the default. That does not seem to be like the same type of categorical change that we see with third-party cookies at this point in time. That might change, but that's not what we're seeing today. But it is being looked at.
I'm right in thinking also, you could go to a Safari browser, for example, turn up your security settings to 11, and you would have the sort of experience that would be
exactly.
the experience. Yep. So that's one way of looking at it and
that's
kind
one
of
way of
testing
looking
it for
at
yourself.
Yep. And definitely Safari would be a good one. Chrome also has a lot of toggles and switches that you can activate to see how this would work if third-party cookies are completely phased out, which today is not yet the case, but that is expected to happen. So yeah, a lot of this you can experience yourself by looking at these browser settings.
Brilliant. Another question is this is about Get FTR and Get FTR's unique selling point compared to systems like Third Iron and or Lean Library.
Yeah.
Are they similar, solving a similar problem, or is there a difference?
Fantastic question. And the first thing I want to say is we also actively work or are exploring how we can work together with these solutions. So I don't necessarily see them as competitors, but more alternative approaches that could potentially strengthen each other. The key difference is where the entitlement/holdings information comes from. Most of the services that you mentioned would get that from a library resource, the so-called knowledge base. It's often called, I think. Get FTR gets the information from the publisher system and does that in sort of quasi-real time. It's all API calls, which means the entitlement information is more granular. It's DOI based and not journal-based. So that's great for hybrid journals, for example, where some articles are open access and others are not. With GetFDR, you would capture that granularity and several. I'm not sure if each of the services that you mentioned do or doesn't do that, but that is often a challenge. And then the timeliness and the accuracy of that information with GetFDR so the quality of the entitlement information and the timeliness is usually superior.
So that leads on to the third question in terms of the sort of the integrity, if you like, of the data itself. So this is questions: are you using unpaywall data to power knowledge of open access? Because the question relates to there are inconsistencies in the data, whether it is open access or not.
Yeah. We are very mindful of those inconsistencies. I need to check if we categorically do not use unpaywall data, but if we do it, definitely with a quality filter, and we get most of the information directly from publishers.
Okay, great. Then the final question, which is about researcher integrity. And it's about how do you prevent bias in the verification of editors or reviewers or authors?
Great question. And we have absolutely need to make sure that we do not create bias, right? That is fundamental to this work. I think the first thing to call out is that we don't see this as an alternative to assessing the quality and the merits of a scholarly work in and of itself, right? This is not trading for the actual peer review that still needs to happen. This is an additional layer of research integrity, security around that. So the question of bias, I think you could sort of detail that a little bit, and how do you make sure that the system does not introduce bias and who has access to the required methods or to enter these verification methods and infrastructure and who doesn't. And that's tricky. I think that does underline the importance of this framework approach and not say everybody needs to start using, say, institutional email addresses or federated authentication or passport verification, because in some parts of the world, that's just not going to work. So it needs to be a portfolio of solutions that are sort of comparable or interoperable in this matrix, right? That they would get, there's a range of options that get you to the same trust level that might be required to fulfill a specific action. More work is definitely needed to make sure that we have a good coverage of those methods that indeed does not introduce bias and makes this accessible and inclusive to scholars all over the world. We have some thoughts about additional verification methods that could be added into the framework, but we definitely welcome additional suggestions if people have any.
That's great. I think that is time. If there's a really, I'm going to ask. Well, I think we're eating into my time, so I'm happy to ask this question because you talked about seamless access, the importance of a coherent UI, a coherent user experience. Why do you think more publishers haven't done more to improve their UX?
I'm not sure if I fully understand where that observation is coming from. If I look at the portfolio, the number of publishers that have some form of an integration with seamless access, I think there has been actually quite a lot of traction and movement. Or is that not what you are referring to?
I think I was referring to, so there's a long tail of sort of 3,000 publishers that Open Athens works with that haven't integrated that better experience into their institutional access. And I just wondered is it competing priorities? Is it that the technology is quite esoteric or quite niche? I just wondered your view.
It is probably all of the above, right? We have, both Open Athens and initiatives like seamless access work hard to make it as simple and as easy as possible. But at the end of the day, there's always some work. And we also know that there are many in a world that has so many technology aspects to consider and to look at and to investigate, there are always competing demands. So I think that will definitely be part of the
and actually, just for those librarians who are on the call, what we see, it is often when the librarian, i.e. the customer, makes that push to improve the experience, often that's where we see the publisher respond. So Hylke, brilliant. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much again. My pleasure.